The South China Sea has been among the most frequent topics of global news in recent years, featuring military drills, repeated trespassing, vessel clashes,
by Coast Guard ships and fishing boats.
To detect illegal fishing.
Is seen as the biggest perpetrator of illegal fishing.
There has been a long-time dispute in some waters here over who has the right to fish legally and who doesn't. Even ordinary fishing activities have the potential to ignite geopolitical conflicts, especially with countries outside the region stoking up tension. Things are getting more complex and unpredictable.
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine some kind of small fishing dispute that escalates and could ultimately result in great power confrontation between the US and China.
An increasing number of articles and commentaries have been published to help paint the dispute as a good versus evil struggle, accusing China of controlling the South China Sea and exploiting fisheries. While it may be fashionable to demonize China, is this perception even accurate? Why are countries like the Philippines and the US so eager to bash China? In short, this dispute is not just about fish, but about interests. For neighboring countries over territorial waters and hence the resources. And for certain outsiders, it's about geopolitical goals and power relations. Throughout human history, fishing disputes are, to a large extent, territorial in nature, especially when countries disagree on where a border should go. Historically, there used to be little dispute of this kind in the South China Sea, as Chinese activities in the region date back over 2,000 years. China's legitimacy over the waters is evident in both historical records and modern-day studies.
I personally traveled to an idyllic seaside village on the Chinese island province of Hainan 2 years ago. Fishermen lived there have for centuries been using a small handbook to navigate the South China Sea, handed down through generations. Experts believe the content provides evidence of China's territorial claims in the region.
In recent years, the dynamics shifted as more outside countries began to increasingly assert their presence in the South China Sea. Western media and pundits often cite the 2016 award issued by the so-called South China Sea Arbitration Tribunal as evidence to deny China's territorial sovereignty in the region.
Now, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague has ruled in favor of the Philippines. The court said that China has no historic title over the waters of the South China Sea.
If we look at news reports from that time, many of them follow the same narrative. A court under the United Nations, known as the Permanent Court of Arbitration, or PCA, ruled in favor of the Philippines' claims against China. This gave the public the impression that the decision was made by a world court under the United Nations, and that China was defying the rule of law. Is it true? Shortly after the news came out, the United Nations and the International Court of Justice issued statements in both Chinese and English, clarifying that they were not connected to nor involved with the arbitral tribunal established for the South China Sea dispute. Looking back, the then Manila administration, emboldened by Western support, tricked the world into believing the ruling was legitimate and supported by the UN. Here's how they managed to make the lie work. The main judicial organ of the UN is the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court. This court is situated in a building in the Netherlands called the Peace Palace. The same building also happens to house another organization, the PCA. Unlike the World Court, the PCA is not a court, but an administrative body. It provides administrative services to tribunals, including those held among private parties. In other words, the PCA is not a UN agency, and certainly is not the World Court. It just coincidentally shares the same office building with the World Court. This is where things get weird. Although the 2016 tribunal had no legal relationship with the UN, it still sparked a media frenzy backed by the West. The story was spread all around the world that a UN-backed court had made a ruling that's legally binding. But in fact, as a Filipino journalist later revealed, the decision was made by a 5-man panel of arbitrators who were all Europeans except one, a Ghanaian who is a London resident. And they were paid hefty fees for each day of the hearing by those who filed the case, namely the pro-Philippine sponsors. Usually, before a tribunal of this type, both sides have the right to select judges. But this time, none of the 5 arbitrators were appointed by China. The case was brought unilaterally by the Philippines, with support from some Western countries. Over the years, there has been confusion among the public that the 2016 case was handled by a UN-backed tribunal and that China broke the law, all thanks to misleading reports. What's often left out is the fact that the U.S., a key supporter of the 2016 case, has not ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea even to this day, while 168 states and the EU are already parties to it. So, as one of a tiny number of holdouts, the U.S. is still not a party to the legal framework established at a UN convention nearly 30 years ago. Yet all the while, it spent years bashing China for not accepting a decision that was not even made by an organization with a status on par with the UN and the World Court. Across the Pacific, in the Philippines, when those who filed the 2016 case were busy framing China as the biggest villain, illegal fishing within the country's borders remained rampant. After years of fish catch decline due to overfishing and nationwide reclamation projects, the Philippine government's lack of effective policy led to worsening conditions. Official data from 2019 show that 27 to 47% of fish caught in the Philippines were from illegal fishing. On the flip side, though, the China-bashing game helped politicians divert public attention from problems at home. Now that member states of ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, are forging closer ties with China, the Philippine administration has really painted itself into a corner here. After all, the peoples in neighboring countries are neighbors for eternity, though the outsiders may have their own agenda.
The U.S. approach is a military-first and often a military-only approach. We arm who we want. We call for NATO enlargement no matter what other countries say may be harmful to their security interests. We brush aside anyone else's security interests, and when they complain, we ship more armaments to our allies in that region.
And I think my country is being used as a pawn or a proxy by the United States. That's really the fact of the matter. But of course, Filipinos like us, we don't want to have problem with the China. China is like a close neighbor. We cannot change geography. So as much as possible, Filipinos and Chinese have to work it out together, and the dispute should be managed carefully, open-mindedly and pragmatically speaking.
The servant leader is servant first. With the different forms of conflict and violence in our country, it is even more significant that we think of strategic ways to secure peace on a stronger and more sustainable foundation. If we want to invest to a peaceful nation, we have to start nurturing a culture of peace in the heart of every child.